Look at a map of the world right now. Pick any continent, any coastline, any remote island in the middle of the ocean. Humans got there somehow. People with Stone Age technology crossed deserts that should have killed them, oceans that should have stopped them, mountain ranges that should have turned them back, and they did it tens of thousands of years before anyone invented the wheel. Some of these migrations make sense. Walking from Africa into the Middle East, following coastlines into Southeast Asia. These are logical paths that follow food and water and favorable climate. But others defy explanation. Routes that required crossing hundreds of miles of open ocean journeys through environments where survival seems impossible. Arrivals at locations that should have been unreachable. If you are settling in for the night, this is perfect company. The mystery of how our ancestors got to impossible places. It has been puzzling researchers for decades. It can keep you company while you drift off. Subscribe and stick around. Let's start with the most baffling migration of all Australia. Humans arrived on the Australian continent at least 65,000 years ago. Some evidence suggests they may have arrived even earlier, perhaps 80,000 years ago. Either way, they got there during the Ice Age, when sea levels were much lower than today. Lower sea levels meant more land was exposed. Indonesia was connected to mainland Asia by a landmass called Sundaland. Australia was connected to New Guinea by a landmass called Sahul. But between Sundaland and Sahul, there was always open ocean, at least 60 miles of it, often much more. 60 miles of open ocean. Think about what that means for people with Stone Age technology. No metal, no sails, no navigation instruments. Probably just simple rafts made from bamboo or logs lashed together, and yet they made the crossing, not once, but repeatedly over thousands of years. Enough people to establish a viable population. How did they know Australia was there? You can't see it from the other side. The curvature of the Earth hides anything beyond about 15 miles. They would have set out into open ocean with no guarantee of finding land on the other side. That is not migration, that is exploration into the complete unknown. Some researchers believe they might have seen smoke from natural fires on the Australian coast. Others suggest they followed birds or floating vegetation that indicated land nearby. But none of these explanations fully account for the decision to paddle a raft into the open ocean for days with no certainty of survival. And it wasn't just one crossing. Genetic evidence suggests multiple waves of migration into Australia over thousands of years. Different groups making the same impossible journey. The first crossing might have been an accident, a raft blown off course. But the subsequent ones were choices, deliberate decisions to attempt what should have been impossible. The people who made these crossings were anatomically modern humans. Same brain size as us, same cognitive abilities. They could plan ahead, assess risks, make rational decisions, and they looked at 60 miles of open ocean and said, "Yes, let's try it." What were they thinking? What drove them to take such risks? The traditional explanation is population pressure. Too many people competing for limited resources. The ones who stayed faced starvation. The ones who left had a chance at something better. Desperation makes people do extraordinary things. But here is the thing. The populations in Southeast Asia 65,000 years ago were not dense. There was plenty of land, plenty of resources, The evidence doesn't support the idea that people were being pushed out of overcrowded territories. Something else was pulling them forward. Some anthropologists believe humans simply have an innate drive to explore, a curiosity that pushes us toward the unknown regardless of practical necessity. The same impulse that would eventually take us to the moon was already present in those Stone Age mariners. They crossed the ocean because they wanted to know what was on the other side. If that is true, it changes how we think about human nature. We're not just survivors, adapting to circumstances. We're explorers, seeking out new circumstances. The urge to go beyond the horizon might be as fundamental to our species as language or tool use. But the Australian migration is just the beginning of the puzzle. Consider the Pacific Islands, tiny specks of land scattered across the largest ocean on Earth. Some of them are thousands of miles from the nearest continent, and yet humans found them all, colonized them all, built thriving cultures on islands that seem impossible to reach. The Polynesian expansion is often called the greatest feat of navigation in human history. Starting from somewhere in Southeast Asia, voyages spread across millions of square miles of ocean over roughly 3,000 years. They reached Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, places separated by distances that would challenge modern sailors. The Polynesians developed sophisticated navigation techniques, reading stars, interpreting wave patterns, following the flight paths of birds. Their knowledge of the ocean was encyclopedic, passed down through generations of careful teaching. They weren't stumbling onto islands by accident. They were finding them through skill and accumulated wisdom. But even with all their skill, the distances involved are staggering. Hawaii is over 2,000 miles from the nearest inhabited islands. Easter Island is over 1,000 miles from anywhere. To reach these places, voyagers had to sail for weeks across open ocean with no landmarks, no GPS, no radio if things went wrong. And they brought everything needed to establish colonies. Not just people, but pigs, chickens, dogs, edible plants. Enough supplies to survive until crops could be harvested. The logistics of transporting all of this across thousands of miles of ocean on wooden canoes is almost incomprehensible. The question that haunts researchers is why? Why undertake such dangerous voyages? Why risk everything to find islands that might not exist? The Polynesian homelands weren't impoverished. The islands they left were rich in resources. Something else was driving them outward. Some scholars point to social factors. Younger sons who couldn't inherit land, feuding families seeking escape, political refugees fleeing conflicts. The Pacific became a pressure valve for social tensions, with the ambitious and the desperate heading out to find new worlds. Others emphasize the cultural prestige of exploration. In Polynesian societies, navigators were honored figures. Finding a new island brought tremendous status. The voyage itself was a rite of passage, a way of proving oneself worthy glory. Not necessity drove the expansion. But here is where the migration pattern starts to make even less sense. The Polynesians weren't the only people crossing impossible distances on the other side of the world. Different groups were making equally baffling journeys with far more primitive technology. The first Americans arrived at least 15,000 years ago. Probably earlier, The traditional theory said they walked across a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska during the Ice Age. That makes sense. Sea levels were lower. The bridge was exposed. Walking is easy, but walking across the bridge was just the beginning. From Alaska, these first Americans had to travel thousands of miles through some of the harshest environments on Earth. Ice sheets covered much of northern North America. The interior route was blocked for most of the Ice Age. How did they get through? The emerging answer is that they didn't go through. They went around along the Pacific coast, following the shoreline from Alaska to California, a coastal route that required boats' maritime skills, the ability to survive on marine resources. These weren't just hikers, they were seafarers. Evidence for this coastal route is hard to find because the coastline from 15,000 years ago is now underwater. Rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age drowned the archaeological sites we would need to confirm the theory. But genetic and archaeological evidence from interior sites strongly suggests the coast was the path. If the coastal route theory is correct, then the first Americans were accomplished mariners who crossed from Asia to the Americas by boat. Not across the land bridge, but along the coast and perhaps across stretches of open water. The similarities to the Australian migration are striking. And here is where it gets really strange. There is evidence suggesting humans might have reached South America before they reached North America. Sites in Chile and Brazil have produced dates that seem too early for a simple north to south migration. It is as if some groups skipped the north entirely. How is that possible? One controversial theory suggests that some early migrants crossed the Pacific directly, from Southeast Asia or Polynesia to South America. A voyage of thousands of miles across the open ocean, undertaken tens of thousands of years before the Polynesian expansion. Most archaeologists consider this theory unlikely. The distances are too great, the technology too primitive, the evidence too sparse. But the anomalous dates keep appearing, sites that seem too old, artifacts that seem out of place. The conventional timeline keeps getting challenged. The honest answer is that we don't fully understand how humans populated the Americas. The more we learn, the more complicated the picture becomes. Multiple migrations at different times using different routes. Maritime capabilities we didn't expect. Timelines that keep getting pushed back. Now consider Madagascar. This large island off the coast of Africa was one of the last major land masses to be colonized by humans. People didn't arrive until about 1500 years ago. That seems late. Africa is right there. You can see Madagascar from the mainland on a clear day. Why did it take so long? Here is the strange part. When humans did finally reach Madagascar, they didn't come from Africa. They came from Indonesia. Genetic and linguistic evidence is clear. The first Malagasy people crossed the Indian Ocean from Southeast Asia, a journey of over 3,000 miles, bypassing the African coast entirely. Think about how bizarre that is. People sailed past Africa, which they could see, to reach Madagascar from Indonesia, which is on the other side of the ocean. They had to cross one of the most challenging maritime environments on Earth. Monsoons, storms, currents that could sweep them off course. Why would Indonesian seafarers travel 3,000 miles to colonize an island next to Africa? What motivated such a journey? What route did they take? Did they know Madagascar was there, or was it a fortunate accident? The questions multiply faster than the answers. Some researchers believe the Indonesian colonists were part of the broader Austronesian expansion, the same maritime culture that would later populate Polynesia. These were people who had made ocean crossing a way of life. For them, 3,000 miles might have seemed like a reasonable challenge. Others suggest they were following established trade routes. Indian Ocean commerce connected Indonesia to Africa for centuries before the Madagascar colonization. The colonists might have been traders who decided to stay, or refugees who needed to disappear, or simply explorers following their curiosity. The Malagasy language provides tantalizing clues. It is most closely related to languages spoken in Borneo-specific Bornean languages. Not just a general Indonesian connection, this suggests the colonists came from a relatively small, identifiable population, possibly a single voyage or series of voyages from a specific community. But Borneo to Madagascar is an enormous distance. The voyage would have taken months under the best conditions. The colonists would have needed to provision for a journey with no certain end, to navigate waters they'd never seen before, to find an island they may not have known existed. And they succeeded, not just in reaching Madagascar, but in establishing a thriving population. They brought their language, their crops, their animals, their culture. They transformed the island's ecology by introducing rice cultivation and cattle herding. They created something permanent in a place that should have been unreachable. The Madagascar colonization joins Australia and Polynesia as one of the great maritime mysteries. How did people with simple technology cross vast oceans? What drove them to attempt the impossible? And why did they succeed when the odds seemed so stacked against them? If you are still with me, consider what these migrations reveal about human nature. We are not a species that stays put. Even when conditions are favorable, even when resources are abundant, even when there is no rational reason to move, we move. Something in us refuses to accept that the horizon is the end. Every generation produces individuals who look at barriers and see challenges, who hear that something is impossible and take it as an invitation, who would rather die trying to reach a new world than live comfortably in the old one. These people drove human expansion. They're still among us today. But there is another pattern in these impossible migrations that deserves attention. They weren't random wandering. They weren't people stumbling blindly into the unknown. There was intention planning, accumulated knowledge passed between generations. These were organized expeditions, not accidents. The Polynesians developed their navigation techniques over centuries. Each generation added to the knowledge, refined the methods, tested the theories against real voyages. By the time they reached Hawaii and Easter Island, they had millennia of maritime wisdom encoded in their traditions. Similar processes must have occurred with earlier migrations. The first Australians didn't just luck into successful ocean crossings. They developed the skills over generations, practiced on shorter voyages, built up the courage and capability for longer ones. The big crossings were the culmination of long preparation. This suggests that impossible migrations weren't the acts of desperate individuals. They were cultural achievements, the products of societies that valued exploration and invested resources in developing the necessary skills. Societies that looked outward rather than inward. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What happened to all the voyages that failed? For every successful crossing to Australia or Hawaii or Madagascar, how many canoes were lost at sea? How many expeditions set out and never returned? The migrations we celebrate were built on the graves of those who didn't make it. The archaeological record preserves the successes, the populations that established themselves, the cultures that took root. But it says nothing about the failures, the rafts that sank, the voyagers who starved, the islands that were never found. History remembers the winners. The losers vanish without a trace. This might explain why the migrations seem so impossible. We're not seeing the full picture. For every successful voyage to Australia, there might have been dozens of failures. The 60-mile crossing might have been attempted hundreds of times before anyone made it. The odds weren't as long as they seem because so many people were trying, but even this explanation has limits. Even if many attempts were made, each individual attempt still required extraordinary courage. Each person who set out into the unknown was risking everything on uncertain odds. The aggregate success was built from individual acts of almost suicidal bravery. What kind of person makes that choice? Psychologists have tried to identify the traits that drive exploration: novelty seeking, risk tolerance, low anxiety, openness to experience. The personality profile of an explorer looks different from the average person. Natural selection may have concentrated these traits in certain. Some research suggests that populations descended from migrants show higher rates of these traits. The gene variants associated with novelty seeking and risk tolerance are more common in populations that moved long distances. The migration itself selected for the personalities that made it possible. This creates a fascinating feedback loop. Explorers migrate. Their descendants inherit explorer traits. Those descendants are more likely to migrate again over generations. Some lineages become increasingly mobile, while others stay put. The human species diversifies into settlers and wanderers. But if that is true, then the impossible migrations weren't performed by typical humans. They were performed by the extreme edge of human personality distribution. People who were, in a sense, born to explore, whose restlessness was genetic as much as cultural. This doesn't make their achievements less impressive. If anything, it makes them more so. These were people who couldn't have been content staying home, who were driven by forces they probably didn't understand to seek out new horizons. Their restlessness was a gift to the entire species, and their legacy is everywhere. Every person living in Australia, Polynesia, the Americas, Madagascar, or countless other locations reached by impossible migrations carries the genes of those ancient pioneers. The traits that made the migrations possible still echo in their descendants. If you are drifting off now, consider that you might carry some of those genes too. Somewhere in your ancestry, someone made an impossible choice, crossed an uncrossable barrier, reached an unreachable place, and because they did, you exist. Their courage became your inheritance. The human migration pattern that makes no sense makes perfect sense. When you understand human nature, we're a species of explorers, wanderers, people who look at the impossible and see an invitation, The pattern makes no sense if you expect us to be rational. It makes perfect sense if you accept that we're dreamers. And the exploration continues. The same impulse that drove ancient mariners across unknown oceans now drives us toward space, toward Mars, toward destinations that seem as impossible today as Australia seemed 65,000 years ago. The dream hasn't changed, only the scale. Someday, descendants of those first Australian migrants might set foot on other worlds, carrying the same restless genes, driven by the same incomprehensible urge to see what is over the next horizon. The pattern will continue because it is built into who we are, but that is for future generations to achieve. For tonight, let the mystery of past migrations carry you into sleep. Let the ancient voyagers keep you company in the dark. They crossed oceans that should have stopped them, reached places that should have been unreachable, and they did it all without knowing if they would survive. That is courage, real courage. The kind that builds civilizations and populates continents and transforms a small African primate into a species that covers the globe. The impossible migrations were acts of faith as much as acts of skill, faith that the ocean had another side, faith that the risk was worth taking. Thanks for spending this time with the wanderers, the dreamers, the people who looked at impossible distances and saw possibilities. Subscribe and stick around for more journeys into the parts of history that defy explanation. Sleep well, and when you dream, maybe dream of the ocean, of a small raft heading toward an invisible horizon, of people who had no right to succeed but succeeded anyway. That is the human story. That is your story. That is all of us. Good night. The horizon is still out there. It always will be. But before you drift away completely, there are more impossible migrations worth knowing about. Journeys that challenge our assumptions about ancient human capabilities. Routes that shouldn't have been possible but somehow were. Consider the colonization of the Arctic. Some of the most inhospitable environments on Earth were settled by humans thousands of years ago. The Inuit and their ancestors spread across the frozen north from Siberia to Greenland, adapting to conditions that would kill most humans within hours. The Arctic isn't just cold. It is completely hostile to human survival. For much of the year, there is no sunlight. Nothing grows. The only food comes from hunting marine mammals through holes in the ice or stalking caribou across frozen tundra. One mistake means death, and yet people not only survived there, they thrived. They developed technologies perfectly suited to their environment. Kayaks and umiaks for hunting on the water, igloos that used snow as insulation, clothing made from caribou hide that trapped body heat more effectively than modern synthetic materials. The migration across the Arctic was relatively recent, happening within the last 5,000 years. But it still raises profound questions. Why would anyone choose to move into such a hostile environment? What drove people northward into conditions that seem designed to kill them? The traditional answer is population pressure pushing people to the margins. But the Arctic wasn't a margin. It was a completely different world requiring completely different skills. The transition from boreal forest to Arctic tundra wasn't gradual adaptation. It was a fundamental transformation of how people lived. Some researchers believe the Arctic was colonized by specialists, people who had already developed marine hunting skills and saw the frozen north as an opportunity rather than a barrier. For them, the abundant seal and whale populations were an attraction, not the ice that surrounded them. This suggests that impossible migrations often depended on specific skills. The people who crossed to Australia were probably already accomplished seafarers. The people who colonized the Arctic were probably already marine mammal hunters. The journey itself was just an extension of capabilities they already possessed. But even with the right skills, the psychological challenge was immense. Imagine leaving the relative comfort of the boreal forest to venture into a world of permanent ice, knowing that one bad winter could mean starvation, knowing that your children would face the same risks. That takes a special kind of courage. Now consider another impossible migration: the settlement of high-altitude environments, the Tibetan Plateau, the Andean highlands, the Ethiopian mountains. Humans colonized places where the air is so thin that most lowlanders can barely function. At 14,000 feet, the oxygen content of each breath is only 60% of what you'd get at sea level. Physical exertion becomes exhausting. Thinking becomes difficult. Most people who visit high altitudes experience headaches, nausea, and confusion. Long-term exposure can cause serious health problems, and yet millions of people live at these altitudes permanently. The Tibetan Plateau alone has been continuously inhabited for at least 30,000 years. The Andean highlands have supported complex civilizations for millennia. People don't just survive at altitude, they build cultures and empires. How did they adapt? Genetic studies reveal that high-altitude populations have evolved specific adaptations to low-oxygen environments. Tibetans carry gene variants that regulate hemoglobin production differently than lowland populations. Andean peoples have larger lung capacity and different heart function. These adaptations took thousands of years to develop, which means the first people to colonize high-altitude environments didn't have them. They moved into places where they could barely breathe, where every task was exhausting, where their bodies were constantly stressed, and they stayed long enough for evolution to catch up. That is not rational behavior. A rational species would stay at comfortable altitudes where survival is easier. But humans pushed into environments that were actively hostile to their biology. They let natural selection reshape them rather than accepting the limitations of their bodies. The same pattern appears with other extreme environments. Deserts that should have been impassable were crossed. Rainforests that should have been impenetrable were settled. Swamps and marshes and volcanic islands and frozen wastelands. If a place could theoretically support human life, humans eventually got there. And not just marginally, humans didn't just survive in these places. They developed sophisticated cultures adapted to each unique environment. Desert peoples invented irrigation and oasis agriculture. Rainforest peoples developed sustainable farming systems that worked with the ecosystem rather than against it. This adaptive creativity is perhaps the most remarkable human trait. We don't just tolerate difficult environments, we transform them into homes. We develop technologies and practices that turn barriers into opportunities. We refuse to accept that any place is truly uninhabitable. But there is a darker side to this story. Many of the environments humans colonized were already inhabited, not by other humans, but by other species. And human arrival often spelled disaster for the existing wildlife. Australia had giant kangaroos and car-sized wombats before humans arrived. The Americas had mammoths and giant ground sloths. Madagascar had elephant birds and giant lemurs. New Zealand had moas. Within a few centuries of human arrival, most of these species were extinct. This pattern is so consistent that scientists have a name for it. The overkill hypothesis. Humans arrive. Large animals that have never seen humans don't know to fear them. Hunters kill them efficiently. Populations collapse. Species vanish. It happened on every continent and major island humans reached. Some researchers dispute this theory. They point to climate change and other factors that might have contributed to the extinctions. But the timing is suspicious. On continent after continent, the extinctions coincide almost exactly with human arrival. Climate changed many times before without causing similar die-offs. The impossible migrations that we celebrate may have been ecological catastrophes for the places humans reached. Our success came at a cost paid by other species. The world we inherited is emptier than the world our ancestors found. That is not a comfortable thought to fall asleep with. But it is part of the story. The human migration pattern that makes no sense makes even less sense when you consider its consequences. We spread across the globe for reasons we don't fully understand, transforming every ecosystem we entered. Whether that transformation was mostly destruction or mostly adaptation depends on your perspective. Humans did drive many species extinct, but humans also created new niches. Domesticated animals spread alongside us. Agricultural systems produced more food than wild ecosystems could support. The world that humans made is different from the world we found. Not necessarily worse, just different. And that transformation continues. We're still changing our environment, still adapting to new challenges, still spreading into new territories, even if those territories are now space stations and undersea habitats. The impulse that sent ancient mariners across impossible oceans is the same impulse that sends modern explorers to the deep sea and outer space. The scale changes, the technology changes, the fundamental drive remains the same. Humans go where humans can't go until they can. And someday, perhaps sooner than we think, humans will make another impossible migration. To Mars, to other planets, to destinations we can barely imagine today. The pattern will repeat because it is encoded in our species. We can't help but explore. When that happens, the same questions will apply. Why are we going? What drives us to risk everything for uncertain rewards? Why can't we be content with what we have? The answers will be the same as they've always been. Because we're human, because the horizon calls, because we can. But all of that is for the future. For tonight, rest with the knowledge that you belong to an extraordinary species. A species that looked at impossible barriers and refused to accept them. That crossed oceans and deserts and ice sheets and mountain ranges, that spread to every corner of a planet and is already reaching for the stars. The migration pattern makes no sense because it didn't have to make sense. It just had to happen, And it did over and over again, on every continent and every ocean, driven by an impulse that transcends rational explanation. That impulse lives in you. Whether you've traveled the world or never left your hometown, you carry the genes of explorers. The restlessness that drove ancient migrations echoes in modern forms. The urge to see what is over the next hill, the curiosity about distant places, the dream of somewhere else. Not everyone acts on that impulse. Most people in every generation stay home. They build communities, maintain traditions, provide the stability that wanderers need to return to. Both settlers and explorers are essential. Both are fully human. But somewhere in your family tree, someone moved. Someone took a risk. Someone crossed a barrier that should have stopped them. And because they did, you were born where you were born. Their impossible journey became your ordinary starting point. That is worth thinking about as you drift off. The improbability of your own existence, the chain of impossible decisions that led to you. If any of your ancestors had turned back, had stayed put, had accepted the barrier in front of them, you wouldn't exist. But they didn't turn back. They kept going, across oceans and mountains and deserts and ice, through dangers they couldn't have imagined, toward futures they couldn't have predicted. And here you are, the product of countless impossible journeys. So rest now. Let the ancient travelers watch over your sleep. They've earned that honor through journeys we can barely comprehend. Their courage made the world you live in possible. Their restlessness gave you a planet to explore. Thanks for spending this time with the impossible migrations, with the journeys that shouldn't have happened but did, with the patterns that make no sense until you accept that humans don't always need things to make sense. Subscribe and stick around for more explorations of human history's strangest chapters. More questions that don't have easy answers. More evidence that our species is far stranger and more remarkable than we usually give ourselves credit for. Good night. The horizon is still calling. It always will be. But tonight, you can rest. The journey will wait until you wake. Sleep well. Dream of ancient oceans and unknown shores. Dream of people who dared to go where no one had gone before. Their dreams became our world, and our dreams will become someone else's world. Someday, the human migration pattern that makes no sense. It is the story of our species. It is the story of you, and it is not over yet. There is one more aspect of these impossible migrations that deserves attention before you drift off completely. The role of pure accident in human expansion. Some of the most consequential movements in human history may have happened by mistake. Consider how many islands might have been discovered by fishermen blown off course, how many coastlines found by sailors who got lost, how many new territories stumbled upon by hunters following game that led them somewhere unexpected. Intention played a role, but so did luck. The first person to reach Australia might not have meant to. A raft caught in a current, a storm that pushed travelers further than they planned, days of drifting with no control over direction, and then, against all odds, land. Not the land they knew, but land nonetheless. If this is true, then the impossible migrations weren't always feats of planning and skill. Some were feats of survival after plans failed. People who found themselves in impossible situations and somehow made it through. The heroism of coping with disaster rather than executing strategy. This might explain why some migrations seem so irrational. No one would choose to cross 60 miles of open ocean on a primitive raft. But if you are already on the ocean and the current is carrying you, choice doesn't enter into it. You survive or you don't, the ocean decides. And if you survive, if you reach land, if you manage to establish yourself in a new place, then you've accomplished an impossible migration. Not through intention, but through resilience. Not through planning, but through refusing to die when death seemed certain. The distinction matters because it changes what we celebrate. The intentional explorer is admirable for courage and skill. The accidental survivor is admirable for endurance and adaptability. Both achieved the same result, but through very different paths. Human expansion probably required both types. The intentional explorers who pushed boundaries deliberately, and the accidental survivors who found themselves beyond those boundaries through no choice of their own. Together, they covered the globe. This also means that human expansion was probabilistic, rather than deterministic. Given enough time and enough people attempting the impossible, some would succeed by accident alone. The question isn't why anyone crossed to Australia. It is why it took so long given how many people must have been blown out to sea over the millennia. Some researchers have run simulations asking exactly that question. How long would random drift take to carry enough people to establish populations on isolated islands? The answers suggest that accident alone could explain much of human expansion, given sufficient time. But accident can only explain so much. The Polynesian expansion required too much precision to be accidental. The techniques were too sophisticated. The routes were too long. You don't accidentally sail to Hawaii and bring pigs and chickens with you. That requires intention. So the truth is probably a combination. Early migrations driven largely by accident and survival. Later migrations increasingly driven by intention and skill. The two threads interweaving throughout human history as our capabilities grew. This might also explain the acceleration of human expansion over time. Early movements were slow because they depended on random events. Later movements were faster because they depended on accumulated knowledge and deliberate effort. The impossible became possible as intention replaced accident. And now we're at a point where virtually no place on Earth is beyond intentional reach. We can go anywhere we want. The question isn't capability but choice. Where do we choose to go? What drives those choices? Why do we still feel the pull of the horizon when we've already been everywhere? Some people feel it more than others. The restlessness that drives exploration seems to vary between individuals. Some are content to stay home. Others feel an almost physical need to move, to see new places, to experience different environments. The wanderlust isn't universal, but it is persistent. If you feel that pull, you are connected to every explorer who ever lived. The same impulse that drove ancient mariners across unknown oceans might be tugging at you too. Different in scale and context, but fundamentally the same. And if you don't feel that pull, that is fine too. The settlers who stayed home were just as essential as the explorers who left. Someone had to build the communities that explorers departed from and returned to. Someone had to maintain the knowledge and traditions that made future exploration possible. The human expansion was a team effort spanning hundreds of thousands of years and millions of individuals. Explorers and settlers, risk-takers and stability keepers, wanderers and homebodies, all of them contributed to the species that covers the globe today. You are part of that team regardless of your own inclinations. Your existence depends on both the explorers and the settlers in your ancestry, the ones who moved and the ones who stayed, the impossible journeys and the patient endurance. As you fall asleep tonight, you can rest knowing that you belong to something larger than yourself, a species that faced impossible barriers and crossed them anyway. That spread to every corner of the earth through courage and accident and pure stubborn refusal to accept limits. The human migration pattern that makes no sense is actually the most human thing there is. We don't accept barriers. We don't stay in our lane. We go where we shouldn't be able to go and somehow survive. It is what we do. It is who we are. And tomorrow, when you wake up, the world will still be full of barriers waiting to be crossed, problems waiting to be solved, horizons waiting to be explored. The journey isn't over. It never will be. That is the glory and the challenge of being human. But for now, rest. Let the ancient travelers keep watch. They've seen things we can only imagine, crossed distances we can barely comprehend, survived challenges that would break most of us. They earned their rest, and so have you. Good night from all the wanderers who came before, from the accidental survivors and the intentional explorers, from the ones who crossed oceans and the ones who crossed continents, from everyone whose impossible journey made your ordinary existence possible. The migration pattern makes no sense, and that is exactly why it matters. It shows us what we're capable of when we stop asking whether something is possible and just try anyway. Sleep well. The horizon will still be there tomorrow, and part of you will always want to see what is beyond it. That is not a weakness. That is the gift your ancestors gave you. Use it wisely. Good night.